Welcome back to the Home Lab, and today I thought we'd celebrate the Chinese New Year by looking at a figurine that you will have all seen regardless of nationality, the Beckoning or Lucky Cat. Last year I noticed at the start of Chinese New Year our local supermarket was selling these cat figurines, and Barry saw one and immediately wanted it for his bedroom, and it's been waving at him and bringing him luck ever since. So I thought this year, with the start of the Chinese New Year, we'd have a look at the history of the Beckoning Cat, where it comes from, and particularly for this channel, how it works inside. So, in order to do this, I ordered myself a Beckoning Cat, which came quickly, was simply packaged, and which would enable me to take it apart and explain how it works. But first, a bit of history. It's unclear when the Beckoning Cat made its first appearance, but a range of Japanese folklores mention cats, and one or more may have cemented the idea of the Beckoning Cat, or Maneki Neko, into Japanese culture. My favourite story mentions Nayataka from the 17th century, who, when returning from a hunting trip, stopped at the Gotokuji temple for a break, narrowly missing a wild storm, having been beckoned in by a cat. Out of gratitude, his family clan supported the impoverished temple financially, helping it rise from poverty to a place of prosperity. The cat, due to its actions, now became a recognised sign of prosperity. But stories aside, I thought we'd have a closer look at my Beckoning Cat holding its Japanese gold Koban coin and take it apart and see how it actually works inside. It runs on a single 1.5 volt AA battery, and that seems to last for ages. So what we'll also try and do is see just how much power this figurine consumes. So, with the cat taken apart, we can now see what's hiding inside its body. It consists of four main parts: the waving or beckoning arm movement, the circuit that causes the arm to remain swinging, a source of power, the battery, and of course the outer case that holds it all together. So let's just create a little bit of space here, and I've pushed the circuit board back into its position here, and you put the arm back in as well so you can see where that goes. And if you look carefully, there's a little sort of frictionless area here, a sort of bearing, and one there. So that's what the arm swings on. But if we lift the arm out, you'll notice the arm's got quite a lump of iron on it and two magnets attached to that. So I'll have a look in a minute at how the magnetic field on these is orientated, so you can see how that works, and we'll see how that magnetic field interacts with the coil of wire that's here on this little circuit board that has on it only a few components. You can see a resistor, a couple of electrolytic capacitors, and a single transistor. So let's now have a look at how the magnets are orientated here to show what the magnetic field is due to the magnets. And you can probably guess, because they're on a sort of iron armature, shall we call it, that it might go north, south, north, south. So we've got basically a sort of horseshoe magnet. And there's an easy way to test. You've got to be a bit careful with this. But here's a magnetic needle on a compass. And I'm going to bring this magnet close to it. So you'll see that it attracts the north magnetic pole, and the north magnetic pole is a north magnetic pole because it points to the north of the Earth, and on the top of the Earth, do you remember this from school, is a south magnetic pole. Always very confusing. But watch what happens when I turn it over. There we go. So now the south magnetic pole is attracted to this magnet, so this one must be a north pole. So what I can do is I can label this one north, and let's turn it around. This one attracts the north of the compass, so this one must be a south pole. So we've got a magnetic field here caused by these two permanent magnets, with field lines coming out of the north, coming round and going into the south and then along the back. So as I said, it's kind of a horseshoe magnet. So now we understand the shape of the magnetic field, we can put that to one side. And isn't it appropriate that in the year of the fire horse we've got a horseshoe magnet there? Or maybe that's just me and the way I think. So let's now have a look at how this little circuit works and how it can give a little push to the arm every time it swings to keep it swinging, powered by just one AA battery. So with it all taken apart and a few wires soldered in, we can do some rather more intimate testing on the Cat and perhaps find out what power it runs at. So let me show you what I've done here. I've disconnected the positive lead from the battery that leads to the circuit board, and I've put an external wire on the positive lead of the battery and onto the circuit board, and I can join them together, and you'll notice the Cat starts moving, but it will allow us to put some test gear in between these two and see if we can get some useful measurements. And when I disconnect them, it does keep going for a while, but that's the inertia in the system, and there are frictional losses, and it will stop after a few moments. So without a 1 ohm resistor to hand, I've put two 2.2 ohm resistors together, and I have actually tested them, and in parallel they seem to come out at almost exactly 1 ohm. So I've got a 1 ohm resistor in series with the Cat's power supply, and that'll enable us to connect an oscilloscope and make some measurements of voltage changes, and we can also calculate current and therefore the power that the Cat uses. So with the poor old Cat all scoped up here on its 1 ohm resistor, you'll see the DC movement there, which shows a current pulse from the power supply going through the resistors. You'll also notice there's some high frequency signals on there, which we won't worry about too much at this stage. So let's switch to XY, turn the intensity down a little bit, and you'll see hopefully that the dot on the oscilloscope screen is bobbing up and down ever so slightly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in a bit there. And these are not brilliant measurements, these are just sort of play measurements. I'm making the point of what you can do if you've just got a few moments. And you'll notice that it's bobbing up and down between the 0 and it's going down about half a division. So half a division, it's set for 5 millivolts per division. So we're getting pulses here of about 2.5 millivolts. Now 2.5 millivolts across a 1 ohm resistor is a current flow of approximately 2.5 milliamps. So it's all very sort of simplified and generalized, but of course that will allow us to work out the power of the Cat. And if you think of the battery as being about 1 volt, you can straight away in your head say, okay, well, we've got a Cat that's operating at about 2.5 milliwatts. It's a 1.5 volt battery, so we're a little bit higher. So shall we call the Cat a 3 milliwatt Cat? And then we can work out how long we'd expect our battery to last. So let's do a quick Cat battery life calculation. So battery life. And see how long we think a single AA battery will last, knowing what the power of the Cat was. So on the oscilloscope, if you remember, we had 5 millivolts per division. So it was set for 5 millivolts per div. And when we actually did our looking at the pulses, we found that we got approximately half a division. So that was 2.5 millivolts. Now, if you remember, the way we did that is we had a 1 ohm resistor, and if you measure 1 volt across 1 ohm, you've got 1 amp flowing, and if you measure 2.5 millivolts across 1 ohm, you have 2.5 milliamps flowing. So we had a current flow of about 2.5 milliamps. Now, the next thing to do is to say, okay, so what's the power of our cat? So power is volts times amps. Now, this is a Fermi calculation, which means we're making loads of assumptions. We're assuming it's all constant DC, etc. But if you know about Fermi calculations, they're fantastic because you can very quickly on the back of an envelope get an idea for what's happening. So for the power, yep, that's going to be the current times the voltage, or the voltage times the current. So let's say 1.5 volts in the cell times by 2.5 milliamps. So that gives us a power of about 3.75 milliwatts. Now, again, Fermi calculation, it wasn't on all the time. The pulses were very short, etc. So should we just say approximately 3 milliwatts? Now, it's probably much lower than that, but that will do for now. So let's have a look at what we need to do to get the battery drain and how long the battery is going to last for. So the drain from the battery was about 2.5 milliamps. There we go. And I looked up AA batteries and found that a typical AA battery has an energy of about 2000 milliamp hours. So the AA battery is approximately 2000 milliamp hours. So if you know, the milliamp hour means you could draw 2 amps for an hour and the battery would basically be flat, or you could draw 2000 milliamps for an hour. That's the same as 2 amps and you get the same effect. Or sort of in our case, you could draw only 2 milliamps and it would last for 1000 hours. So if we say this drain, to make the math simple, remember Fermi calculation, is approximately 2 milliamps, our battery, if we draw only 2 milliamps, is going to last for 1000 hours. And if you divide that by 24, so you take your 1000 hours and you divide it by 24, you get approximately 42 days. So we'd expect our battery to last about 1.5 months. Now, obviously this has made lots of assumptions. The pulse wasn't on all of the time. And I noticed with Barry's cat in his bedroom, the battery lasts for way longer than that. But at least it gives us some idea of how long a battery would last in this cat, which uses almost no power at all. The other thing you'll notice is that the pulse's amplitude depends on whether the cat's working or not. So I'll start the arm working there and you'll see the pulse is working really well. But when I stop the arm, the pulse intensity drops almost to 0. So if I now remove the battery and short out the battery terminals on the cat and swing the arm, you'll notice we don't get the pulses on the scope anymore, which means the pulses we saw were genuinely power being provided by the battery to power the circuitry inside the cat. So a very rough test, I know, but with about 14 pulses in 10 seconds, that gives us a frequency of about 1.4 hertz for the pulses. So I've now connected 2 wires across the coil that interacts with the magnets on the swinging arm, and we'll put the cat back together and we'll see what signals we get across this coil here. So after a major bit of cat surgery and connecting the wires across the coil on the circuit inside the cat and then putting it all back together again, you'll see on the oscilloscope we get some really interesting pulses. Now I'm sorry this isn't a storage oscilloscope, but you can see the shape of the pulses. And what's interesting is if we stop the arm, those pulses' amplitude goes back down to 0, and start it again and you can see the pulse pattern building up again. So with the poor old cat opened up again, let's have a close look at this circuit and explain how it works. So let's have a look at the cat's circuit in a little bit more detail. And this is really interesting. I'm going to show you a better drawn circuit in a second. But the first thing I did was work out where all the wires went on the little circuit board and draw my own circuit. And I've got it right. But some of you looking at it, apart from saying it's really badly drawn, is that there's something very odd going on here. That the emitter of the transistor is pointing away from the negative rail. And I tore my hair out with this and went round and round in circles. I tested the transistor out of the circuit. I looked at all sorts of other things. And that is how the transistor is wired up in my circuit. But I got kind of fixated by the fact the transistor was the wrong way around. So I kind of failed then to see how all of this was working. I had an idea of how it worked because it's very similar to the way some of these electronically driven magnetic pendulum clocks work. But I just kind of got stuck. So I had a chat with the wonderful Dr. Peter Jones, who runs Electromagnetic videos, and that's a channel you really should look at. And of course, he just dug me out the hole and said, look, just imagine the transistor the other way round. It will work this way round, but let's turn it round and see what happens. So after my chat with Dr. Peter Jones, I've redrawn the circuit, showing it a bit more clearly. And what we're going to do is, instead of taking the wiring of the transistor that I've got on my Cat, we're going to ignore this and we're going to put the emitter here. Now, the transistor will work the other way around, but it's much easier to understand if I draw it like that. So it's really quite a simple circuit. It consists of three parts: power supply, a coil of wire that senses the magnet on the arm of the Cat swinging past it, and then another circuit, a drive circuit, that gives a sharp pulse which gives that magnet a push to keep the arm waving. So these two coils, firstly, are wound on the same bobbin, so they're coaxial, so they will interact with each other, and that's quite important, and they're centre tapped. So have a think about the self-starting to begin with, and this will apply for the Cat that's solar powered as well. So it's relatively easy to understand. Firstly, we've got a current path here and a resistor here that will provide some bias to the base of the transistor. But the transistor will be off until we switch on, and as we switch on, there'll be an inrush current here into the capacitor, and as the capacitor charges, there'll be current into the base, and here we go, down to the negative terminal, and that will switch on this transistor. If the transistor switches on, there'll be a rush of current through the second coil, which will create a pulse, which will kick the magnet on the arm of the Cat. But here's the clever bit. Because these two coils are wound on the same bobbin, and they're wound in the correct direction as well, any changing magnetic field here will induce a current in this magnet, so it'll kind of boost the effect. Think of it as the primary and secondary of a transformer. So the pulse here actually goes back to the sensing circuit to make sure that we get a really strong pulse. But once the capacitor's fully charged, there'll be no current through it, and if there's no current through the capacitor, the transistor will switch off and we will have to wait for the next swing of the arm. So I thought it might be worth mentioning another method that keeps this transistor well and truly off when it doesn't need to be on, and that's one of the beauties of this circuit because it's very, very low power indeed. So when it first works and gives a kick, we've got a changing magnetic field in L2 when the transistor's turned on. But after a while, with the transistor fully on, the current in L2 will be constant. So there won't be a changing magnetic field. And if there's no changing magnetic field here, that can't then couple with L1 and induce an extra current here that was giving the boost to keep the transistor on. So the transistor will switch off, and here's the clever bit. When the transistor switches off, both of these coils' magnetic fields, and particularly this one, will immediately collapse. The collapsing magnetic field will induce an EMF in the opposite direction, keeping the transistor well and truly off. Now, there's a couple of other things I haven't mentioned. You'll notice these dots on the coils, which I'll come to in a second, and this capacitor here. Now, this is a very low value, so this capacitor's job, as far as we can see, is to just absorb any high frequency signals or spikes that might suddenly come along and damage this transistor. Here you'll notice the value of the capacitor is much, much higher. And interestingly, if you look at the time constant here, it's around 26 seconds, which is interesting and gives you an idea of how long this resistor would take to discharge this capacitor. Now, let's very quickly deal with the dots because they're quite important. If you haven't come across this before, let me explain. We said that a pulse in this coil creates a changing magnetic field that induces an EMF in this one. And it's really important we wind these coils in the correct direction so that any change in magnetic field here, the changing magnetic field that this coil feels, induces an EMF to cause the current to increase in it and not to cancel the current that's already flowing through it. So, to show which way we wire these turns, we put dots on them. Think of it very quickly as the primary and the secondary of a transformer, and we always show the polarity with these dots, the same polarity at any given moment in time. And I always think of it as on the primary, we're feeding power into the transformer, so think of that as the place that current goes in. And on the secondary, we're taking current out, so think of that as the point that the current comes out of. It's a pretty simple lesson that on what these dots are, but it can be a bit confusing because some people think this shows the direction of current going in and this also shows the direction of current going in. But if you think about it, the primary is kind of a load with the current going into it, and the secondary acts a bit like a power source with the current coming out of it. Anyway, I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Now, with all this talk of the transistor on my circuit being wired the other way round, in other words, this here is the emitter, why don't we swap it round to the way that I drew the circuit when I was describing it? So, instead of being my circuit, it's going to be this one. So I've taken out the transistor and I'm going to turn it around and we'll see if the cat still works. So with the transistor back on the board, and I've used some Vero pins to do that. When did you last use Vero pins? We've got the transistor on the other way round, or the way that we think it should be wired up. Let's put the cat back together again and see what happens. So with the cap put back together again and the transistor wired up in what we think is the right way, let's put the battery in and see what happens. Well, that's interesting. I'm thinking that that's not working at all. So let's reverse the process and see if the cat works again. So with the transistor wired back onto the circuit as it was originally, in other words, sort of the wrong way round, guess what? Put the battery in and it works absolutely perfectly. So I'm going to admit that's a little bit of a mystery. It may be due to the biasing of the transistor, I'm not totally sure. But I always like to say with these things, over to you and let me know in the comments what you think's going on with this mystery cat. But I'm going to take the cat apart just one more time because there's one other little thing I'd like to show you, and it involves which magnetic pole do we get created on the coil when the arm is given a little bit of a push. So to do this, what I've done is I've just connected a red wire up to the centre tap, so I'm at this side of the coil, and a black wire here, which is going to be negative on the other side of the coil. So there it is. Let's put those out of the way. So there's the black wire and there's the red wire. So we're driving current in the correct direction. And I've got my little compass here, and we'll see whether the compass needle moves and which way it moves compared to the face of the coil here. So just a 1.5 volt cell. Got to be careful to connect it the right way around, and confusingly black here is positive. So there's the negative, and what I'll do is I'll just touch on. and it's a very small movement, but do you see the needle moving? And what it's doing is it's attracting the white needle, so that's the south magnetic pole. And if you remember, south magnetic poles on compasses point towards the South Pole, so it seeks out South Pole, so there must be an effective North Pole on the South Pole of the Earth, which is a bit confusing, and you might remember that from your exam days, GCSE and O-levels perhaps. And the other thing you'll notice is that we might get a small oscillation to begin with, and that's true of the cat arm, but if I feed in energy at the right rate, and I'm probably not doing it here, you can build that oscillation up and up. So what have we noticed? Well, if we pass current the correct way through the coil, this face of the coil, which faces the magnets on the cat's swinging arm, the face here becomes a North Pole. I nearly said South Pole there, becomes a North Pole because it's attracting the South Pole of my compass. Now that's really interesting, because if you remember that the face of the coil was a North Pole, and if I take the arm out for a second, you might also remember there are two magnets here. This one has a North Pole and this one has a South Pole on its face. But if I put them back together again, there we go, inside the cat, the bit that's very hard for me to show you is that the North Pole here is actually further away from the centre of the coil than the South Pole is. Now that makes perfect sense. If you think about it, when there's a pulse, the pulse will repel the north and attract the south. Then when the pulse stops, the arm will fall back again, and the same process will happen. And it seems to work really well, because if you look at what I was doing on the oscilloscope, there's a pulse every oscillation, so not on the back and the four-stroke, but just backwards. So that makes perfect sense. The North Pole on the coil repels the North Pole here, briefly attracts the south, and then when that collapses, it swings back again. And as I said earlier, the oscillation can build up and up and up. So I think that's more than enough cat surgery. So let's put the cat back together again and get ready to celebrate the Chinese New Year. So there's the Maneki Neko, or the Beckoning Cat, or the Lucky Cat. And I think it's rather nice on this image. You can see that it genuinely has its own heartbeat. I just wanted to say, with this being the start of the Chinese New Year, a huge thank you to all my friends at PCBWay who have been incredibly supportive of the channel. And when I email them, I always get absolutely fantastically helpful and kind replies back and encouragement to continue what I'm doing. But it occurred to me that now you know how these lucky beckoning cats work, you might want to make your own circuit and then get PCBWay to make circuit boards for you to build that circuit on. In fact, you could get a few of them made and maybe make a number of these lucky cats for the whole of your family. As you know too, they've got an absolutely fantastic website, and on that website you get loads of ideas for projects that you might want to do. Anyway, thank you PCBWay, thank you for supporting my channel, and I'll put a link below just above the comments to their website so you too can have a look at what they do. So finally, I hope you enjoyed that video and you feel you've got a better understanding of how the Beckoning Cat works, its history, and of course its significance. All that remains for me to do is to say a very, very happy New Year to all my friends, and especially my Chinese friends, wherever you are around the world. I wish you a very prosperous Year of the Fire Horse. I'll be making some more videos, as you know, throughout the year, and I do hope when the celebrations are over, you'll join me then.